When I was 7, maybe 8, I remember being in our front yard under the big tree with the tire swing, standing in a tiny Walmart kiddie pool, trying over and over to step on top of the water and start walking. Because the Bible said that when Peter had faith, he walked on water, and everyone said the Bible was true, and I had faith, so I reasoned I should be able to walk on water if I'm a good Christian. Of course, part of my brain never really believed this would happen, but everybody else told me the Bible was real and true, and that God made the world in 7 days, and that Mary was a virgin, and that Jesus walked on water. And if the Bible was true then why couldn't I walk on water now? I remember in those days that everyone believed in God, but nobody really believed in God in our place and time. People believed in the God we would see in heaven when we die, and the God who watches over us, and in the God who really wanted us to be good Americans, but nobody thought God would act today in our world. That was for another place and time after we died or thousands of years before we were born. But I believed the Bible was true, and I believed that God was alive and with us now, because that's what I was told. So every now and then, whenever I thought about it, in the kiddie pool, or swimming at camp, or at hotels, I would take some time, lift my legs out of the water, and plant my feet on the surface again and again and again, waiting until I got it right and believed enough to walk on water. I never did get it. Sometimes I still try just for the heck of it. You know, there are some religious scholars and others who say that the walking on water wasn't actually the point here. They say that Peter didn't have faith at all. Some observe that when Peter says, "Lord, if it is you," before asking, his language is like that of Satan tempting Jesus in the wilderness. So he was actually trying to test Jesus here. They say that this question was a doubt in itself, and he walked out because he needed proof. And we're not supposed to need proof, so if he were a more faithful disciple, he would have stayed in the boat. It strikes me that these are probably the same people who say that miracles literally happen, but they don't anymore because reasons. And God is really, really real, but only in heaven. Because whatever they say, Peter had enough faith to step out of his boat in the middle of a giant storm that had tossed the disciples around for hours, with waves lapping up onto the sides and crashing down in a violent way, which doesn't really make him sound like a doubter to me. This was not a kiddie pool. Peter's question came with real risk. And if he didn't have faith in Jesus to take care of him, he would have been tossed out in giant crashing waves and would probably have sunk or lost the boat in seconds. Which is why I think that particular bit of exegesis is probably coming from the same people who don't believe that God is actually here, acting in our world. And who probably don't want to, because that would require more of them. Because they would have to risk something, and they might not be safe. And though a storm is still frightening, it is far easier to be a disciple sitting in the boat than the one stepping out of it. And the boat is a much safer place to pontificate on what it means to have true faith. So they stayed in the safe places, critiquing the faith of those who step out. And as they did that, I kept trying to step out on top of the water. When I was around 15, I was born again 6 or 7 times. Because they tell you that you have to be really, really sure you're saved, or else you might not really be saved, and I really, really wanted to be sure. I drew a red letter A on my hand in Sharpie every day because I knew I was a sinner. And I would spend 2 or 3 weeks in a zealous frenzy trying to do every single thing right until I remembered what masturbating was, did it, immediately felt guilty, and assumed I had gotten it wrong again. At which point I would wait until the next retreat and then be born again. I would spend every night on the front lawn staring up at the sky, begging God to help me get it right. And I became terrified that I would grow up and become an atheist, which it turns out I needn't have worried about. I went to every Sunday, every Wednesday, every retreat and camp, every Bible study, and every prayer meeting because internally I was afraid I was getting it wrong. And I thought that even if I was right, I might eventually lose faith and stop believing and then be wrong and then go to hell. And I was even more afraid because I knew I was gay. And I didn't really think God hated me, but what if I was wrong there too? So in my fear and uncertainty, I latched on to everything that looked like Jesus, mostly because everyone else there seemed so certain, and I wanted that. I hadn't considered yet that maybe they were just pretending and waiting inside the boat because they were also afraid. Instead, I secretly kept trying to walk on water because it would be a sign that I was doing things right. I, of course, forget here that walking on a tossing sea hadn't exactly made Peter more certain either. Even though he was literally standing on water walking towards Jesus without sinking, he was worried too. He felt the wind and saw the waves and heard the thunder, and even though he was doing the impossible, which you might consider to be a sign, he was still busy thinking of all the things that could go wrong. Maybe lightning struck. Maybe the wind blew him over. Maybe he tripped. I mean, do you think about this? He could walk on water, but did that apply to tripping? Like if he skipped over a wave, would he just go right in face first? I don't know. Many people who read this story see Peter as weak during this time, like his faith wasn't sufficient. They sometimes see his faith as even weaker than before because he had tangible proof and still couldn't trust Jesus when things got rough. These, I assume, are inside the boat people. They know that we're all supposed to believe because it's what good Christians do. And so they do. And I don't know if they ever even wonder or if they might be wrong because it's so taboo. Or maybe they do wonder internally, but they know that they can't say it because that would make them anathema. So they pretend to each other or they pretend to themselves, but it amounts to the same thing. They stay in the boat. And it's easy for them to look at another Christian struggling or drowning and point and laugh. Because it's always easy to chastise someone struggling with their faith when you've never risked testing your own. So they laugh. As Peter began sinking and I became born again another couple times. When I was 18, nearly 19, I realized I could no longer continue being faithful to God while keeping my life a secret. As a gay man, and always having been so, I knew that my faith could not grow until I stopped living in the shadows. And I was terrified, trembling, consumed, short of breath, but I knew for the first time in my life that God was calling me. So sore afraid as I was, I had to do it. I remember I would nightly walk by the Hudson River, watching the waves crash and praying with my voice shaky that God be with me and give me strength. I made this walk every night for weeks and stared at the waves and prayed. And when the time came, I fumbled and I said everything apologetically, but it happened. Around 6 months later, sitting on a dock watching the swans swimming on a Tennessee river, I realized that God had been calling me to ministry, and I am absolutely certain that I could not have gotten to that point had I not stood and prayed for strength and done what seemed to me a leap of faith at the time. I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but I found myself at several times racked by doubt and disbelief, praying to God about my troubles only to stop halfway through, realizing that I was troubled by the question of whether God existed, but I was praying to that same God and didn't actually have any doubts that she was listening in the first place. I was worried about doubt in my head, but faith came so second nature to me that my first instinct was to pray about it. And I think the same element is here in this story, because when Peter walks in the water, he begins to sink, supposedly because he found his faith shaky and began to lose his trust. But in this fear, when he began to sink, his first instinct was to cry out and reach towards the same Jesus he supposedly did not trust. It's a paradox, I imagine, that looks strange to those inside the boat, because they wouldn't know what that kind of prayer is like. Having never risked, having never let themselves question, having never really even come close to the terror of sinking, I'm not sure if they realize what it means to reach out to God. Of course, they've always assumed that God doesn't act on earth anyway, so how would they know what it feels like to feel yourself falling and throw yourself around a God you're not even sure is there, desperately clinging for safety? They don't know what it is to need a life preserver or to be pulled onto the shore, coughing and shivering. If trust is to be built between or among people or between a person and a deity, it comes from relying on one another and learning through experience that the other will come through. It comes from first slowly dipping our toes into the water, exposing small inward secrets, and finding our confidants can be trusted. We're asking small favors and finding our needs met, until the other person or people or deity has come through often enough that we know we can leap into water and feel secure that they will catch us, or if need be, bring us back up to the surface. How true is that for God? The sinking is an integral part of trusting and finding our faith. If we never leave the boat, if we never take a risk, if we never feel the waves lapping against our heels, slowly rising, how will we know that God is there to catch us? And how will we be able to risk the next jump when we need to? I was stronger when I trusted the path God laid out for me, and I was finally ready to accept the call on my life. Peter's faith must have been stronger when he found that even when faced with his own doubt, he could rely on Jesus to save him when the waves encroached. Who would either of us be if we had never risked the jump and learned that God can be trusted? What would our faith look like? When I was 26, fresh out of seminary, working as a chaplain at a Long Island summer camp, I stood on a beach and I talked to kids about Peter's story, beginning the same way I began tonight. How once I stood in a pool that reached my ankles and attempted to walk on it. But as I told them this, I walked little by little into the bay at my back until I eventually dove fully clothed into the water, and everybody gasped. I explained to them that there is one kind of faith that seeks to float above the world, staying on top of the water, never getting wet or messy, and that there is another, seeing the world in all its ugly mess and salt water, that jumps in and rejoices in the mess that God has made. I told them that sinking needn't be a bad thing, and that true faith can engage with the world even when it's not neat and perfect. And I invited them to jump in with me, so that as I sang our first hymn of the night, we all swam and jumped and splashed as a beloved community in waves that doesn't stand inside the boat but jumps in. Months later, having returned to Boston, jobless, depressed, wondering what was coming next, I found myself questioning again, struggling to keep my head above water in a messy world. I had dreams where storms came and waves crashed into buildings so tall that I could see whales swimming next to high-rise office buildings. And this was a hard time and my faith was floundering, but in time, accepting the leaping and the sinking and the reaching, I held on, and it was okay. I don't know that I've heard many inside the boat people talk about the dark nights of the soul, the sinking feeling, the reaching out. I'm not sure if they know how sometimes you feel yourself sinking, and sometimes you reach out, and sometimes you walk across the water, and sometimes you're on top of the world, and sometimes the water's up to your neck. And I don't know if they realize that one day you feel the waves threatening to overcome you, and the next you're floating above them. And I don't know if they realize that your faith can go from drowning to master of the storm in an instant, because I'm not sure they've tried hard enough to realize this. But I know this, that there are still plenty of us who have made leaps of faith and jumped out of the boat, and as terrifying as that first step onto the waves can be, it's kind of miraculous that there are so many of us willing to take it. Miraculous that we all walk through this world, some floating, some swimming, sinking, reaching out for help, reaching out to help others, and some just gleefully splashing in the waves. And I know it's incredible to remember when you're sinking down and the world goes on around you, and the current keeps everyone else floating along somehow like they always have. And I know that it is a joy always to find yourself swimming in the currents of this beloved community of God's children, but you can't stay there unless you step out. And I feel sad sometimes for those kids 2 years ago on the shores of the Peconic who decided to stand on dry land and watch the rest of us splash and play in gleeful praise, but that's the deal. There are some who sit in the boat who never take risks and who go about their day never testing their faith, so never finding out that they can depend on it. And there are some of us who look like a mess sometimes, but even when sinking and appearing to drown, are floating and swimming and splashing in a sea of love and a river of grace, and who are never truly let down to sink beneath the waves. 2 days ago, at age 28, I finished writing that sermon exactly as I had wrapped it up, and I gotta say I liked it. It felt personal and true to the text, and I thought it was kind of fun and uplifting at the end. And then yesterday, reading disgusted about the actions of Nazi protesters and terrorists in Charlottesville, Virginia, I realized it would be disingenuous to leave it at what I had written. No true Christian can remain silent in the face of such hate, violence, and evil, especially when it arises from the heart of our own country. And yes, I'm afraid I must let you know right now that despite many a tweet to the contrary, this is America. So here's what I have to say about that. I still believe everything I've said here tonight, but I think I've been too vague about the risk that comes from stepping outside the boat. I made this sermon into a piece about a personal journey of faith, and in other places and other times that might have been enough, but not today in America. Because for us, just like those disciples, there's a storm raging on and we are being tossed by it, and it is dark, and like the disciples, we are not entirely sure if we're going to make it out alive. And some of us won't. So let me make it abundantly clear that when I talk about stepping outside the boat, I don't mean something sentimental about personal faith. I mean the risk that comes with faith made into action. I mean the risk that comes when our beliefs about what God's kingdom should be and look like are translated into our way of being in the world. And that might involve standing up and speaking out, even though the foundation is shaky. And that might mean standing in the face of violence, even though the waves crash and frighten us. And that might mean protecting others against violence, even though we are still struggling to find our own footing. We are, every single one of us who knows Jesus, a person standing on the water in the midst of a storm and trying to beat it back. And here too, there are many Christians who stay in the boat, who try to avoid getting political, who promote the value of moderation, who try to see things from both sides or many sides, as our president reminded us yesterday. And in the end, they sing praise songs and offend no one and do nothing at all to further God's work on earth. They stay in the boat, avoiding risk, forgetting that the storm tosses them too. It is by the counsel of these people that we are overcome by darkness, and they will tell you that you are divisive, and they will groan about free speech, and they will condemn violence on both sides as if the oppressed are harming the Nazi boot with their faces. And they will stay in the safe places until the storm overwhelms those places too. And this morning, unfortunately, I am sure thousands of churches stayed inside this boat. They remained silent in the face of yesterday's horrible actions or even tacitly condoned them, but we who know our Maker cannot do the same. The time may be coming when this distinction is more crucial than ever, so let me make this abundantly clear. We must step out of the damn boat. We must leave our comfort zones. We must stand in the street shouting or make people uncomfortable at Thanksgiving. We may have to join fighting if it means protecting others, because there may be coming dark days when violence is unavoidable and the only prayer we have is to be on the right side of it. And it will be a scary world, and we will be unsure, and sometimes we will feel like we are sinking. But nonetheless, let us step boldly out, trusting that our Savior is with us to save us from drowning, and knowing that at the end of this story, He has the power to calm the wind, and we have the power to resist it.